The night was calm, the highway nearly empty. A lone motorcycle rolled into a small roadside diner, its headlight cutting through the darkness like a single flame in the wind. The rider wore no flashy clothes, no heavy jewelry, no symbols of wealth. Just a simple black jacket, worn by time, and a quiet presence that carried more weight than noise ever could. That man was Keanu Reeves. He parked his bike gently, walked inside, and chose a corner seat by the window. To most, he looked like any other traveler, a stranger passing through. His face was calm, his body language soft, almost humble. Yet behind those quiet eyes lived a storm that only a few in the world could understand. But not everyone saw it that way. At another table, a group of leather-clad bikers noticed him. They weren't just eating. They were waiting to be noticed. Their laughter was loud, their boots heavy against the diner floor, their presence a show of dominance. And when their eyes landed on Keanu, this quiet man who looked too gentle for their world, they smirked. "Look at him," one biker muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "Hollywood boy thinks he can just stroll in here?" The others laughed, the kind of laughter that doesn't come from joy but from cruelty. Keanu didn't flinch. He poured himself a glass of water, lifted it with steady hands, and took a slow sip. He didn't look at them, didn't respond. Silence was his shield, but that very silence felt like a challenge to men who thrived on intimidation. One of the bikers slammed his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the diner like a warning shot. A few customers turned their heads, some quickly looked away. The waitress froze mid-step, sensing the storm that was building, and yet Keanu remained calm. He adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, set his glass down gently, and looked out the window as if the chaos behind him didn't matter at all. But make no mistake, this was no ordinary man. This was someone trained, disciplined, forged through years of pain, loss, and endless battles. A man who knew when to remain silent and when to strike. The bikers had no idea. They thought they were mocking a quiet stranger. But in reality, they were walking into a lesson that would change their lives forever. Because that night, their laughter would turn into silence, and their arrogance into regret. The diner's clock ticked steadily, its faint sound mixing with the clinking of cutlery and the low hum of conversations. Outside, the desert wind howled against the windows, rattling them softly. Inside, though, the air was heavy with something unspoken, something approaching. At his corner table, Keanu sat silently, flipping open the menu. His fingers moved with a kind of grace, as though even in the smallest actions he carried discipline. He wasn't in a rush. He wasn't trying to prove anything. To him, this was just another quiet stop along a lonely ride. But for the bikers across the room, it was an invitation. The leader, a bulky man with arms covered in faded tattoos, leaned back in his chair and smirked. His voice, gravelly and sharp, cut through the diner like a blade. "Hey, pretty boy, you lost? Or did you take a wrong turn from Hollywood?" The laughter that followed wasn't casual. It was loud, deliberate, the kind that seeks an audience. Other diners froze mid-bite. Some glanced nervously at Keanu. Others quickly turned their eyes away, pretending not to notice. Silence was safer than standing up to men like these. Keanu didn't look up. He studied the menu, calm, unshaken. The waitress, a young woman balancing a tray of steaming plates, hesitated. She glanced between the bikers and Keanu, her lips pressed into a tight line. She wanted to help, to interrupt, but fear kept her feet glued. The leader's eyes narrowed. He wasn't satisfied. He nudged the man beside him, a tall biker with a scar running down his cheek. "Go on," the leader sneered. "Ask the movie star what he's doing here." The scarred biker rose, boots thudding against the wooden floor as he walked over to Keanu's table. He stopped just a step too close, leaning in, casting a shadow over Keanu's meal. "This seat taken, sweetheart?" he asked mockingly, his voice dripping with venom. Keanu slowly lifted his eyes. There was no anger in them, no fear, only calm. He gave the man a polite half-smile, then looked back down at his menu. It was as though the insult hadn't touched him at all. The biker clenched his jaw, annoyed. He wanted a reaction. The group wanted a show. Yet Keanu offered them nothing but silence. Back at their table, the rest of the bikers hollered louder. One banged his fist on the table. Another mimicked a Hollywood actor's dramatic bow, his laughter echoing through the diner. The customers whispered now, unease spreading like smoke. A middle-aged couple at the counter exchanged worried glances. An elderly man adjusted his glasses and muttered under his breath, "They don't even know who he is." But the bikers didn't care. To them, he was just another stranger. Another man to belittle. The scarred biker reached down and tapped Keanu's glass of water with his finger, tipping it slightly so a few drops spilled across the table. "Careful, pretty boy. Wouldn't want you to drown in this place." The room tensed. It was a small act, almost nothing, but in the silence of the diner it carried weight. It wasn't about the water. It was about dominance. Keanu looked at the spilled drops for a moment. Then without a word he picked up the glass, wiped the rim gently with a napkin, and set it down again. Calm, steady. That quiet defiance, that refusal to play their game, only made the bikers angrier. The leader pushed back his chair with a screech and stood. His boots slammed against the floor as he walked over, each step heavier than the last. By the time he reached Keanu's table, the diner was silent. The only sound was the ticking clock. He leaned over the table, his shadow swallowing Keanu in darkness. "You think you're better than us?" Sitting there with your smug little smile. Keanu finally looked up again. His eyes met the leader's, steady, calm, unshaken. "No," he said quietly. "I just don't think I'm less." The words weren't loud, but they carried through the diner like thunder. A few customers gasped. The waitress froze, her tray trembling in her hands. Even the bikers blinked, caught off guard for a split second. The leader sneered, trying to recover his dominance. He slammed his palm flat against the table, dishes rattling with the impact. "You've got a smart mouth, Hollywood. Let's see if you're still smiling when you're eating through a straw." The scarred biker grinned, cracking his knuckles. Another one stood, stretching his neck. One by one, the group began to rise, their heavy boots pounding the floor, circling closer. Keanu remained seated. His hands rested calmly on the table. His breathing was slow, measured. If he felt fear, he didn't show it. If he felt anger, he hid it well, but his silence was no longer passive. It was the silence before a storm. The waitress whispered to herself, barely audible. "They really don't know, do they?" And in that moment, the diner seemed to hold its breath. The bikers thought they were in control. They thought they were about to humiliate a quiet stranger. But what they didn't realize was that they were standing at the edge of a lesson they would never forget, because the storm was coming. And when it broke, nothing in that diner would ever feel the same again. The diner had gone quiet. No more clinking of forks, no idle chatter. Even the jukebox in the corner seemed muted by the weight in the air. All eyes were on the circle forming around one man, Keanu Reeves. The bikers, now standing, loomed over his table like wolves around prey. Their leather jackets creaked, their boots pounded against the floorboards. Every step closer pulled the air tighter, pressing against the chests of everyone watching. The leader leaned forward, his grin crooked, his voice dripping with menace. "You've got guts, pretty boy. But guts don't mean much when you're outnumbered." His words weren't just for Keanu. They were for the audience, the silent diners watching helplessly. It was theater, cruel theater. And Keanu was cast as the victim. But he didn't play the role. Instead, he sat perfectly still, hands folded neatly on the table. His breathing was even, his posture steady. He looked more like a monk in meditation than a man surrounded by hostility. That calmness, it was infuriating. The scarred biker, the one who had earlier tipped over his glass, finally snapped. He reached down and grabbed a fistful of Keanu's jacket, yanking him forward violently. Plates clattered, silverware skidded across the table. Gasps filled the diner. A child whimpered and hid behind his mother's arm. The waitress dropped her tray, dishes shattering against the floor, food scattering like confetti of chaos. The leader smirked, pleased with the fear spreading across the room. "Go on, Hollywood," he jeered. "Show us that smile now." For a heartbeat, the diner seemed frozen in time. Keanu, dragged half out of his chair, looked directly into the scarred biker's eyes. His gaze was sharp, steady, but not hateful. It was as though he was staring through the man, into something deeper. And then, Keanu spoke. His voice was low, calm, almost gentle. "You don't want to do this." The scarred biker blinked, momentarily unsettled. There was no panic in Keanu's tone, no desperation, just certainty. It was unnerving, a man refusing to fear. The leader laughed, a harsh mocking sound. "Oh, he's warning us now. Careful, boys," Hollywood might call his bodyguards. The bikers erupted in cruel laughter, slapping tables, stomping boots, drowning the diner in noise. But beneath their laughter was something else, unease. Because men like these thrived on fear. And here sat a man who showed them none. The scarred biker tightened his grip, pulling harder, trying to force a reaction. But Keanu didn't resist. He didn't lash out. He simply stayed calm, letting the man expend his fury. It was the quiet before the inevitable. In the corner, the elderly man who had been watching whispered almost reverently, "They don't realize. He's trained for this." The couple beside him leaned closer. "Trained?" the woman asked in a hushed tone. The old man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Keanu. "That's Keanu Reeves. He's not just an actor. He's trained with real fighters, real soldiers. Those men think they're tough, but they have no idea what they're provoking." The words spread in whispers across the room. Faces that once held fear now carried anticipation. The diners weren't just bystanders anymore. They were witnesses. Witnesses waiting for something they could feel but not yet see. The bikers, though, remained blind. The leader leaned in closer, his breath heavy with arrogance. "Last chance, pretty boy. Apologize. Tell us you don't belong here." Keanu's eyes flicked toward him, calm as still water. "Belonging," he said softly, "isn't decided by bullies." The room stilled again. Even the laughter faltered. The words hit deeper than expected, not just for the bikers but for everyone watching. The leader snarled, face red with fury. He slammed his fist on the table so hard the salt shaker toppled and rolled to the edge. "You've got a smart mouth," he spat. "Let's see how it tastes when it's full of broken teeth." The scarred biker shoved Keanu back into his chair, releasing his grip only to raise a clenched fist. The crowd gasped, bracing for impact. But Keanu didn't flinch. His breathing remained steady. His hands rested lightly on the table, ready but patient. His eyes, calm yet sharp, followed every movement with precision. The bikers thought they were in control. They thought the silence was fear. But the truth was, it was discipline. And in that moment, and in that heartbeat before the first punch would fall, the diner itself seemed to hold its breath. Because the line had been crossed, and soon, so would the biker's pride. The scarred biker's fist came down fast, cutting through the air with the weight of fury behind it. But it never landed. In one seamless motion, Keanu shifted sideways, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. His hand shot up, catching the biker's wrist mid-swing. The momentum turned against its owner. With a simple twist, Keanu redirected the force, sending the man stumbling forward and crashing into the edge of the table. Plates shattered, water spilled across the floor. The diner gasped in unison. But Keanu didn't rise with anger. He rose with control. His movements weren't flashy. No wasted effort. Every action was deliberate, efficient, the result of years of discipline, not rage. The leader roared, charging forward, swinging a heavy punch. Keanu ducked low, pivoted, and with a sharp, precise kick to the back of the knee, dropped him to the floor. The man groaned, clutching his leg, shock written across his face. The other bikers didn't wait. One grabbed a bottle from the counter and lunged, glass glinting under the fluorescent light. Patrons screamed, but Keanu's hands moved like water, fluid, unstoppable. He stepped in, blocked the swing with his forearm, and twisted the man's wrist until the bottle slipped from his hand and clattered harmlessly to the floor. A quick sweep of Keanu's leg sent him sprawling onto his back. Another came from behind, trying to catch him off guard, but Keanu didn't even turn his head. He felt the movement, the shift in air. With a backward elbow strike, he caught the man in the ribs, then spun, gripping his jacket and flipping him over his shoulder. The biker crashed into an empty booth, the table splintering under his weight. The diner erupted. Gasps, shouts, the clatter of dishes falling. But through it all, Keanu's breathing stayed steady. His face showed no fury, no pleasure in the fight, only focus. The scarred biker staggered back to his feet, rage boiling in his eyes. He lunged again, this time with a knife drawn from his boot. The blade flashed as he slashed forward. Gasps filled the room. A mother shielded her child. The waitress covered her mouth in horror. Keanu stepped aside with minimal effort, catching the biker's wrist once again. With a controlled twist and a sharp pressure point strike, the knife clattered to the ground. Keanu didn't stab him, didn't hit to injure, he disarmed, then shoved the man back with just enough force to end the threat. "Stop," the waitress cried desperately, though her voice was drowned in the chaos. But it wasn't Keanu who needed to stop. It was the bikers. The leader, humiliated, rose once more, rage burning in his face. He grabbed a chair, lifting it high above his head. Before he could bring it down, Keanu stepped forward. One hand struck his arm, the other pressed against his chest, and with a swift push, the chair clattered harmlessly to the floor. The leader staggered back, gasping, his body trembling as though his strength had been drained in a single moment. Silence followed. All 5 bikers were now sprawled across the diner, groaning, clutching ribs or lying dazed in shock. The once loud laughter that filled the room had been replaced by disbelief, but Keanu wasn't standing like a conqueror. He wasn't gloating. His fists weren't clenched. They were open, calm, ready only if needed. He looked less like a fighter and more like a teacher. Slowly, he crouched beside the scarred biker who was breathing heavily, eyes filled with fear. Keanu's voice was quiet, steady. "You think strength is in fear," he said softly, "but real strength is in restraint, in control. You tried to take dignity from me, but dignity doesn't belong to you. It belongs to every person. You can't steal it no matter how hard you try." The words struck harder than any punch. The diner remained hushed. Every ear clinging to his voice, Keanu stood, straightening his jacket as if the fight had barely touched him. He looked at the rest of the bikers, scattered and broken yet still breathing. "Leave now," he said firmly but not cruelly. "And remember this night not for your pain, but for the lesson." One by one, the bikers struggled to their feet. None of them dared meet his eyes. Their boots, once heavy with arrogance, now shuffled with shame as they staggered toward the door. The silence in the diner was heavy, but it wasn't fear anymore. It was awe. The fight was over, but the lesson had just begun. The heavy diner door slammed shut behind the last biker. Their engines roared to life outside, then faded into the distance like a storm retreating into the night. What remained was silence, a silence so deep it carried the weight of everything that had just happened. The customers sat frozen, some with forks still halfway to their mouths, others clutching coffee cups gone cold. The waitress leaned against the counter, her hands trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. The mother who had shielded her child now lowered her arms, still holding her little one close. And in the middle of that silence stood Keanu Reeves. He wasn't panting. He wasn't boasting. He wasn't even celebrating victory. He simply adjusted the sleeve of his jacket and looked around, his eyes meeting those of strangers who now looked at him with awe. But his gaze wasn't proud. It was gentle, almost sorrowful. He cleared his throat softly, and though his voice wasn't loud, every corner of the diner seemed to hear him. "You all saw what happened tonight," he began, his tone calm, steady. "But this wasn't about fighting. This wasn't about winning." His eyes swept across the room, pausing on the frightened waitress, then on the elderly man at the counter who had silently raised a glass to him earlier. This was about dignity, about respect, and about how easily we forget both when pride and arrogance take over. A murmur rippled through the room. Keanu continued. "Those men walked in thinking power is about fear, that if they can intimidate someone, mock someone, humiliate someone, then they're stronger. But that isn't strength. That's weakness disguised as noise." He paused, letting the words breathe. The mother gently rocked her child, nodding as if she understood every syllable. "True strength," Keanu said, his voice firm but kind, "is restraint. True power is knowing you could hurt someone and choosing not to. Tonight I could have gone further. I could have broken bones, drawn blood, left scars that would last longer than bruises. But what would that prove? That I'm stronger than them? I already knew that. No. What matters is teaching that violence doesn't need to be met with violence. That control is louder than chaos." The diner remained hushed, but the atmosphere had shifted. It was no longer fear, it was reflection. Every person seemed to be examining themselves in the mirror of his words. Keanu looked at the waitress again. "You saw how they treated me when I walked in. You saw how quickly they judged me. The clothes, the silence, the fact that I didn't act like them. That's where it begins. Violence doesn't start with fists. It starts with judgment, with words, with the belief that some people deserve less respect than others. The waitress lowered her head, ashamed, as though the words had pierced deeper than intended. But Keanu wasn't condemning her. His tone carried compassion, not blame. "I've lived long enough to know this truth," he continued. "Every person you see, on the street, in a diner, in a restaurant, is carrying a story you can't see. A burden you can't imagine. Sometimes the strongest act you can offer isn't a strike, but a kindness, a smile, a simple moment of respect. You never know what it might mean to them." The elderly man raised his glass again, this time not in silence, but with a soft, "Here, here." Others murmured agreement. The mother kissed her child's forehead, whispering, "Did you hear that?" "Always be kind," Keanu's expression softened. "I didn't fight them tonight to prove who I am. I fought because they left me no choice. But the lesson isn't mine, it's theirs. And maybe it's ours too. To remember that dignity belongs to everyone. No one should have to earn it by how they look, how much money they have, or whether they fit in." He stepped back slightly, his words hanging in the air like music still echoing after the final note. "If you leave here tonight remembering one thing, let it be this. In a world where you can choose to be anything, choose to be kind. That choice is harder than violence, but it's the one that changes lives." For a long moment no one moved. Then slowly the room erupted. Not in cheers, but in gentle applause. The kind that rises from respect, not excitement. The kind that comes when hearts have been touched. Keanu offered a quiet smile, nodded politely, and returned to his table. He picked up his glass of water, took a sip, and sat down as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But for everyone else in that diner, nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The applause in the diner faded into a hushed reverence. People exchanged glances, each one silently acknowledging that they had witnessed something rare, something far greater than a fight. Keanu sat quietly, sipping his water, as though nothing had happened. Yet around him everything had changed. The waitress approached his table, her steps hesitant but her heart racing. She held a fresh cup of coffee in her trembling hands. Placing it in front of him, she whispered, "On the house. And I'm sorry for before." Keanu looked up at her, his eyes warm and forgiving. "No need to apologize," he said softly. "We all learn. That's what matters." Tears welled in her eyes, not from shame anymore, but from gratitude. At the far end of the diner, the mother who had shielded her child earlier leaned down, speaking gently to her son. "Remember this night," she whispered. "Remember the man who showed us that kindness is stronger than anger." The boy, eyes wide with awe, nodded earnestly. That moment would carve itself into his memory, a seed of compassion planted deep within. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet. The roar of motorcycles was long gone, but their absence left space for reflection. The bikers, though humiliated, carried something heavier than bruises on their skin, the weight of Keanu's words. Hours later, in a dimly lit garage miles away, the scarred leader sat with his crew. His leg ached, his pride was shattered, but his mind replayed the moment Keanu had crouched beside him and spoken of dignity. You can't steal it no matter how hard you try. He had heard insults his whole life. He had been called worthless, had been mocked for his scars, had been told the only way to survive was to make others fear him first. But never had anyone looked him in the eyes, in the middle of a fight, and told him he was chasing the wrong kind of strength. He slammed his fist against the table, but this time not in rage. His voice cracked as he muttered, "He didn't even hate us. He didn't break us. He just made us look at ourselves." The room fell silent. One by one, his men lowered their eyes, shame gnawing at their bravado. For the first time, they questioned the path they had chosen. Back at the diner, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Conversations sparked, not about the fight, but about the lesson. An elderly couple recalled moments in their own lives when a kind word had saved them from despair. A young waitress whispered that maybe tomorrow she'd treat the quiet customers a little differently. The ripple effect had already begun, and through it all, Keanu remained humble. He didn't stand to deliver another speech. He didn't need to. His silence now carried as much power as his words had earlier. As he prepared to leave, he stood and adjusted his jacket. The entire diner seemed to rise with him, not out of obligation, but out of respect. The elderly man at the counter raised his glass one final time. You gave us more than a fight tonight, he said. You gave us a mirror. Keanu gave a faint smile. All I did was remind you of what you already knew. He walked toward the door, each step measured, unhurried. The bell above the door chimed softly as he pushed it open, the cool night air rushing in. For a moment he paused, looking back at the faces inside. Faces no longer filled with fear, but with hope. Then he stepped out and the door closed behind him, but his presence lingered. For the mother, it lingered in the way her son hugged her tighter that night, promising to grow up kind. For the waitress, it lingered in the way she looked at every new customer with fresh eyes, determined never again to judge a book by its cover. For the elderly man, it lingered in the way he held his wife's hand, remembering that respect and dignity were the foundations of love. And even for the bikers, it lingered in the silence of their garage, where for once no laughter, no boasting, no cruelty filled the air, only thought. Days turned into weeks, and the story spread. Customers told neighbors, who told friends, until whispers of the night Keanu Reeves humbled bikers in a diner traveled far beyond those four walls. But the tale was never about the fight itself. It was about what followed, the quiet strength, the dignity, the reminder that kindness is not weakness but the truest form of power. Keanu, meanwhile, never spoke of it again. He returned to his life, his work, his solitude. To him, it wasn't a headline or a legend. It was simply what needed to be done. Yet in the hearts of those who were there that night, and even in the hearts of those who only heard the story secondhand, something shifted. A new awareness. A quiet vow to treat others with more respect, more patience, more humanity. Because once you've seen dignity defended so gracefully, so powerfully, you can never again deny its value. And so the lesson endured, not just in a diner on a quiet night, but everywhere the story traveled. Not the story of fists, not the story of fear, but the story of a man who proved that the greatest victory is to fight for dignity and win without hate.